One thing that is a theological fact, but is not really talked about that much, is the fact that God has a sense of humor. God has a sense of humor. Have you ever thought about that? I remember one time, a long time ago, I watched a Mark Driscoll sermon, and it was talking about God's sense of humor, and it was an interesting sermon. It was not that great. Mark Driscoll was kind of low-hanging fruit back in the day. I used to love him. But anyway, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is when in the Psalms it says that he who sits in the heavens laughs. He holds his enemies in derision. And it's in that sense, it's more of like a mocking kind of laugh. Like, that's your move? Like one of those kinds of things. But God has a sense of humor. We're going to talk about that in just a second. A lot of times you'll hear people say, you'll hear people say things like, if Satan was going to deceive you, he wouldn't dress up like a deceiver. He would dress up like someone you trusted. And then, so yeah, that's true in a sense. But then he'll send you someone like Todd Bentley. You know what I mean? Looks like a clown and is a clown. We're going to talk about Beth Moore in a second, because I think Beth Moore is being used in this way as well. It's part of God's sense of humor. But before we get into that, I wanted to just say, I used to love watching mafia shows and things like that. And the mafia is interesting because the mafia, it's set up, like a bunch of men, but it's men unrestrained, right? So in my most recent video, I said that men should be willing to drop the hammer if necessary and ready and able to do it, metaphorically and physically for that matter. But there has to be a self-control there. To be a true man, you have to have self-control. So you need to have gentleness, when it's appropriate to have gentleness, but then you need to have aggression when it's appropriate to have aggression. And if you're missing one of those, if you're missing the ability to control yourself and be gentle, with your family, with your wife and things like that, that's something that you need to work on. That you're not being a complete man. And in the same way, if you're just this neutered sort of, some lovely kind of man who's no one's ever afraid of, no one respects you enough to be worried about how you might react if they, do something evil or something wrong to you or things like that. If you're a coward, in other words, then you're not being a man. So all aggression is not good, but all, kind of cowardliness and just kind of only gentleness, that's not good either. Here's a great scene from The Godfather. I love this scene.
I don't know what to do. You can act like a man! What's the matter with you? Is this how you turn down a Hollywood Pinocchio that cries like a woman? What can I do? What is it?
So you need a man in your life that'll tell you this kind of thing. I remember one time my father did something like this to me. He didn't smack me, but he basically called my manhood into question because of something that I was doing that was very cowardly. And at the time, I hated him. At the time, I was like, how could you talk to your son like that? I remember, I think I might have been crying or something like that. But looking back, what he said to me, I'm not going to go into it exactly, but what he said to me at that moment when I was acting like a coward was exactly what I needed to hear. You need to find men in your life that are going to be willing to smack you in the face when necessary and say, you can act like a man. Now, why am I saying all this? What's the point? Beth Moore, this is where I say God has a sense of humor. Beth Moore is a perfect avatar for egalitarianism and feminism in the church. A perfect avatar. Because she is the reason, she's the perfect reason that Paul wrote what he wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 2. You couldn't be more of a perfect avatar to stand in place. Paul could have written this about Beth Moore. Because it's not just that she's a woman preaching. It is that. But not only that, but she's a terrible preacher. A terrible preacher. And it's not her fault. It's because women weren't designed to do it. She's a terrible exegete. She's been deceived. She teaches wrongly. She teaches that which she should not teach. If she was a man and taught the way she teaches, she should still not be teaching. She's not qualified to do it. And so many men have cataloged all of her very dangerous errors and heresies and all of this stuff. That I'm not going to go into it here. I point you, just look it up, just Google it, and you'll be able to find out all of the dangerous misconceptions that she has, the deceptions that she's somehow been deceived, but now she's teaching it to others. And let's just be honest, she's being used to normalize sexual immorality in the church, just like Jezebel from Revelation chapter 2. Just like that Jezebel in Revelation chapter 2. She's the perfect avatar. God has a sense of humor. He's using someone that fits 1 Corinthians 2 to a T. and making all of these effeminate men defend her and platform her and promote her. It's absolutely outrageous. Look at what Paul says here. He says this, "Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." This could be about Beth Moore. I mean, she could not be a more perfect avatar for this. She, at church, she's not to teach or exercise authority over a man, which she's doing, and she's to remain quiet. And the reason Paul gives, I didn't write this, don't get mad at me. The reason Paul says this is because it was Eve who was deceived. Beth Moore is seriously deceived. And so God is forcing you. It's like when God, when God, made Aaron ground up the idol that they were worshiping, made him drink it. That's what he's doing with Beth Moore here. I mean, she couldn't be a more perfect reason to preach and teach and insist on 1 Timothy chapter 2. She's deceived. So it's not even like she's a woman preacher, but she's like an excellent exegete and she's a great expositor of the text. She's horrible at these things. And God is forcing effeminate men to defend her place as a legitimate and talented preacher. She's none of those things. She's a good speaker, a better speaker than me, no question about it. But she's a horrible exegete, horrible. And so at the end of the day, the conservative resurgence has failed. And not because there's, tons of women preachers. There are some, like Beth Moore, for example. There are some women preachers, but the real failure of the conservative resurgence is all of the effeminate men who are preaching. That might as well be women. That might as well be women who refuse to stand up and say, look, 1 Timothy chapter 2 is still in effect, and Beth Moore is the exact kind of person that Paul was saying, remain silent. Don't teach. Don't exercise authority over a man. Remain silent. And if you have a question, go ask your husband at home. In Bible times, the people of Israel asked for a king. They wanted God to give them a king to rule over them, to fight their battles for them. In other words, they were a bunch of effeminate men that didn't want to do their own thing, didn't want to take responsibility for themselves, didn't want to fight their own battles, but they wanted a king just like the pagans, just like the pagan nations. That's what they wanted. They were being effeminate, and they wanted a king to rule over them. They didn't want God to rule over them. You see, men understand that they submit to God. God is their master. God is their Lord. They are the bondservant. They are the servant of God. They do what he says. But effeminate men want there to be another layer of authority over them as well. They want a king to do so. That's what they did in Israel's times, and in these days we've got a gaggle of effeminate leaders in our church. Leaders, the conference speakers, the authors, things like that. Effeminate men who want women to rule over them, who want women to fight their battles for them, who want women to go out there and do whatever it is they do, just like the pagan nations do. You see, the pagans have this. The pagans are ruled by women. The pagans let women fight their battles for them. The pagans like all that stuff. And not all, many of our evangelical leaders wanting to do the same. I refuse to believe that this is actually that prevalent. I think if you go to the everyday person in the pews, the godly churches that take the Bible seriously, take God's word seriously, that you won't find all of this desire for women to rule them in the church. You won't find that desire in most churches, but our leaders are doing it. It's just like they did in the old days. They want what the pagans have. And so that's why they promote Beth Moore. They promote the absolute case study for 1 Timothy chapter 2. The case study for it. Not only is she a woman, but she's deceived. Obviously so. She's a terrible teacher. Terrible. And they're defending that because she's a woman, because they want to be like the pagans. They want to be like the pagans. Anyway, I hope this is helpful. God bless.